New Russian cyber attacks on the U.S. just weeks ahead of the midterm elections. Hackers tied to Russian military intelligence, we've learned, set up fake websites to target the U.S. Senate and conservative think tanks. So who discovered all of this? Microsoft, not U.S. intelligence agencies. In fact, the tech giant, which says it did foil the attack, warned candidates and other political groups would have been at risk. All of this coming as President Trump once again doubts that Russia was responsible for interference in the presidential election. We learned that in a new interview with Reuters when the president questioned the definitive conclusion of his own intelligence community, saying, quote, if it was Russia, which may sound familiar because it's actually pretty similar to what President Trump said standing next to Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. CNN's Alex Marquardt is in Washington with the very latest. Alex, of course, 77 days away from the midterm election. So what more do we know about these websites that were found by Microsoft?
Well, Erica, it seems that Microsoft found these, excuse me, in the very early stages before Russia was able to do too much damage. But it does show how active and aggressive Russia still is. And essentially what happened is that this Russian hacking group, Fancy Bear, sorry, Erica, Fancy Bear, which is connected to the Soviet military intelligence. We know that name because they hacked into the DNC in 2016. They were indicted by the special counsel's office. They appear to have set up 6 fraudulent, bogus websites in order to carry out what is known as a spear phishing campaign, which essentially tries to lure people into revealing sensitive data like their passwords for their email addresses. And what Microsoft has said is that the Russians are now broadening their campaign. And the reason that they say broadening is because it now appears to be encapsulating conservatives and Republicans as well. Because if you look at the names of these websites that were set up by Fancy Bear, one appears to be, they want to try to link it to the conservative Hudson Institute, the other one to the International Republican Institute. These are 2 conservative think tanks and 2 think tanks that have been extremely critical of President Vladimir Putin and the Russians and have been in support of sanctions. There you see on the screen some of the board members of IRI. They're some of the most vocal and aggressive opponents of Russia and President Vladimir Putin, including Senator Marco Rubio, Senator John McCain, Mitt Romney, the former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. And then when you look at the other sites that Fancy Bear set up, 3 of the names included the word Senate, which appears to mean that they were trying to go after certain senators, certain Senate offices. It's not clear, because Microsoft did intervene in what looks like an early stage, which senators they might have gone after. But we do know last month we heard that Senator McCaskill of Missouri, one of the most vulnerable Democrats, was targeted also by Russian military intelligence. Now, we have not heard from the White House yet today, but we have heard from the Kremlin. Of course, Erica, you can imagine they did come out denying any knowledge of this hacking group, of these hackers. And it's a pretty remarkable statement. And I'm going to read it. It says, from the U.S., we hear that there was not any meddling in the elections. Whom exactly they are talking about? What is the proof? And on what grounds are they reaching such conclusions? Think about that, Erica. They're saying from the U.S. we hear that there was not meddling in the elections. Every level of the U.S. government, intelligence and political, is saying that there was meddling by the Russians. The only person who's giving a convoluted answer to that question is the president, and he did so again yesterday. Erica?
On that he did, and we'll continue to dive a little deeper into that. Alex Marquardt, appreciate it. Thank you. With us now, Graham Brookie, who's the director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab, which is working with Facebook on the threat of interference in the midterm elections. Brookie was also a top aide to President Obama on cybersecurity. I actually want to pick up right where Alex left off there, because when we look at this response from Russia, and to have it very clearly say from Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, from the U.S. we hear that there was not any meddling in the elections. I mean, is that something that they're getting from President Trump? Where else do you think that could come from?
I think that is straight from the mouth of President Trump. But I think that there is a discrepancy between what we're hearing from President Trump and what we're seeing from the entire U.S. intelligence community, whether that's Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, on through the entire community, which says that interference in U.S. elections, interference in basically anything that undermines Vladimir Putin, is on the uptick and a trend that we're continuing to see.
And so how significant are these discoveries by Microsoft, these websites? Alex laid out what was done, but just put it in perspective for us in terms of the uptick and what Microsoft discovered.
Well, I think one important point here is that this is not new activity. In fact, the actors that Microsoft discussed in their blog post from today are actors that were that we saw in 2016, as the gentleman before me said. The actors known as Fancy Bear are directly linked to Russian military intelligence. What is unique about this is that we're seeing an uptick around elections, and we're seeing an uptick on entities that are not necessarily focused on U.S. elections, but focused on perhaps critical viewpoints of Vladimir Putin, who are up for election or who will also be engaging in U.S. elections.
They're focused on what is best, obviously, for Vladimir Putin. National Security Advisor John Bolton suggested just a couple of days ago that Russia isn't the only threat here. Take a listen.
Well, I can say definitively that it's a sufficient national security concern about Chinese meddling, Iranian meddling, and North Korean meddling that we're taking steps to try and prevent it. So it's all four of those countries, really.
All four of those countries, but are they all on the same par, the other three, with Russia?
I think that what we can say with a high degree of confidence is that Russia is the most aggressive actor in trying to interfere in the United States political discourse. Of course, we would expect other nation states to mount influence operations, but it's abundantly clear that Russia is the most aggressive and most blatant actor.
We know intel agencies obviously here are focused on this threat, and we hear about it being an ongoing threat repeatedly. Is there enough, though, in terms of a coordinated effort, that we can really look at this as being on the offensive at this point?
I think that the response needs to be not only robust and include the entire national security apparatus from across the interagency, whether that's our diplomatic tools, our intelligence tools, our military tools, but this is a truly collective challenge, and we're going to need collective action from not only the United States government, but tech companies and media. Frankly, this is something that all of those entities are vulnerable to and need to be aware of.
We will continue to follow it, Graham. Appreciate your insight today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.